Number 1.
About 3 years ago, my mom and stepdad separated, and she and I and my sister moved out and into a new place. It's in a decent neighborhood, not like a nice neighborhood, but a safe one. It's quiet, and mostly elderly people and young families live there. So moving in, I never felt unsafe, and since this incident, I haven't either. But probably about 6 months after we moved in, there were a couple strange occurrences. One night, my mom was out for the night because she works as a relief worker for a woman's shelter, and the hours are pretty sporadic. So I'm 16 at the time and stay home with my 10-year-old sister to watch her. At like 9:30, I order us a pizza because we're watching a movie together, and hey, I'm a nice sister. Like 15 minutes later, I notice some lights outside of my house and assume it's the pizza guy, which is a little weird because they're never this fast, but I wasn't about to complain. So I get up to the window to just check and see that a small blue car has pulled up on the side of the road in front of my house, turned off, but the driver isn't making any move to get out of the car, or any movement at all. They're just staring straight ahead. At this point, I still think it's the pizza guy, and I'm like, WTF, get out and give me some pizza. But he just keeps sitting there. Eventually, I realize this guy is not here to give me my pizza, so I sit back down and just figure he's waiting for my neighbors to get home. Another 20 minutes pass, and the pizza actually arrives, at which point I start getting uncomfortable because I notice the car is still parked outside my house, and the guy has seemingly not moved. Like, let me explain, it's not like this person was sitting still casually in their car or playing on their phone or listening to music like a normal person would while they wait for someone, but sitting straight upright with their arms rigid out in front of them on the steering wheel. Additionally, the pizza guy asked me if I knew the guy in the car before saying that he had pressed his face up against the window and stared at him as he walked by and approached my front door. So I take my pizza and eat it. Eventually, my sister passes out, and I turn everything off and go upstairs. Every hour or so, I go back to check if the car and the man inside are still parked outside my house, and every time they are. And he's still sitting there the exact same way until I check again at around 2 a.m. Now he's moved from the driver's side to the passenger seat and has his chin resting on his hand, looking out the window, which is facing towards my house. I start getting really weirded out at this point, but still don't do anything, convincing myself that I'm overreacting. So I go back upstairs and wait another hour and a half before checking again. It's like 3:30 at this point, and I think maybe the guy is waiting for me to fall asleep so he can break in and rob us or something. IDK. So this time, instead of leaving the lights off when I pulled the curtain to check if he was still there, I turned them on so he would know I was still up. I also held my phone up to my ear, hoping he'd think I was calling the cops and leave. I didn't actually call the cops because I figured it's technically not illegal to park on the road outside someone's house, and I didn't want it to turn out to be nothing. At this point, he starts getting out of the car. I thought he was just getting out to get back in the driver's seat, but instead, he closes the door and leans against it, putting both his hands in his pockets, and just stares at me. I can't see his face because directly across the road there's a street light, so only his silhouette is visible. After maybe 30 seconds of this staring, I get too creeped out and pull the curtains shut again and call my mom. She's concerned and says to deadbolt the door, and if he does anything else or just doesn't get back in the car, to call the police, which I agree to do, and she hangs up. Finally, an agonizing 2 minutes later, I work up the nerve to peek out again, and he's still just standing there, staring. Now I actually start dialing the number for the police, and just as I go to hit the call button, he abruptly looks up towards my neighbor's house and jumps back in his car. I find out the next day it's because my neighbor opened the front door and looked out at him Apparently he'd noticed the weird car guy too. But weird car guy still doesn't leave. He continues to sit in the car looking towards my house until 6 a.m. I stayed up this entire time because I couldn't sleep. I don't know exactly when he decided to drive away, but the last time I checked was 6. Also, looking back, I'm not sure why I didn't continue calling the police. So anyway, finally, I go to bed and try to write it off as just a weird dude. For the next few days, I spend the nights at friends' houses and just keep busy because it was the summer holidays. When I get home, my mom tells me that every day since I've been gone, a blue car has driven past the house really slowly and honked, but she doesn't recognize the driver. And when she walked outside to take a picture of the car and license plate after it had driven by 4 times, it sped away. She called the police and reported the weird behavior as well as gave a description of the vehicle, and they said they'd keep an eye out for any other incidents involving a car matching our description. 2 weeks after this, the car is parked outside of my house again, but no one is inside, and it sits there until it's towed away. And that's it. I never received an explanation beyond that the car was stolen over 3 months ago in a town nearly 5 hours away. One of the weirdest, creepiest, unexplainable things I've ever experienced.
Number 2.
I joined the Army when I was just barely 17 years old. I was one of the smallest females in my support battalion, but that just made me work harder to fit in with all the guys and pull my weight. A couple months before my first deployment in 2007, my brigade was sent to the National Training Center of Fort Irwin, California, which is in the middle of the desert with absolutely nothing around for miles and miles. Halfway through the rotation, I was tasked to pull medical coverage with our gun trucks and an artillery unit. It was me and one female doctor and about 60 male soldiers all going out into the middle of the desert. It felt like we drove forever, leaving around 0400 and getting to our spot as dawn broke. We were at this gravelly plot of land about the size of a football field behind a large hill. It was barren except for 2 porta-potties at the far left side and a weird half-assed sort of shack that somehow had electricity but was maintained for the cadre, soldiers who worked at Fort Irwin and ran the lanes training. Poor souls. We set up camp with all of the vehicles staged at the right and our medical tent to the far back with our own vehicles. Everyone we encountered was super polite, calling us ma'am and helping out with everything. It was super weird for me, as I was still a private at the time, but I just went with it. In the middle of the setting up, we actually had a patient that needed sutures after a Humvee lid got slammed on his head, so I felt a bit more useful being out there. Night fell, and everyone fell into their respective sleeping areas. The female doc and I were on one side of the tent. Some artillery sergeants were sleeping on the other side of a divide we were able to put up. Since we were alone, and no one really gave a crap about military dress code, I was dressed in all black because it was my warmest clothing. Black PT pants, black thermal thing, and a black PT cap. And I was surprised it was so cold for August, so my dumbass didn't pack accordingly. Around 1 a.m., I awoke, having to go to the bathroom. I was thinking about just holding it since it was cold. I was warm on my cot, and I really didn't want to be wandering around when I could still hear someone talking outside. Well, it got bad enough. I threw on my boots and began the trek to the other side of this damn football-sized gravel field to the pots. I realized the lights were on in the shack and that the cadre must have finally showed up when I was sleeping, and that was who I could hear talking. It was almost a full moon, and the sky was bright and beautiful, full of stars. It was so pretty that I decided to take my time as I didn't see anyone else about and just sort of strolled staring at the sky. All of a sudden, I heard other boots on the gravel, and it was at that moment my stomach dropped. Usually my intuition is pretty good at picking up on creepers before they're even within my line of sight and hearing, but this guy totally snuck up on me. He was walking hard and fast. I turned around and saw a dark figure making a beeline towards me. He was also dressed in all black, which freaked me out, and he also came from the direction of my tent, which freaked me out even more because I saw all of the other people in the tent with me asleep. My heart started pumping as I didn't have a weapon on me, and if this guy grabbed me, I had absolutely no idea if I'd be able to fight him off despite the training I had. I was still terrified. I could hear him basically running at me now, and I was speed walking towards the bathrooms, breath in my throat. I honestly think it felt like I was in a dream. I couldn't believe that this was happening. Maybe he just needed a medic. I was trying so hard to rationalize why this was happening, but the feeling in my gut told me this dude had bad intentions. He slowed down when he was about 10 feet from me. I'm still speed walking. It feels like I've been walking forever now. Mind you, this all happened in less than 60 seconds, but it was so surreal. In my mind, it feels like it took place over 20 minutes. We were right next to that shack now, and I could hear this dude breathing, and he reached out and grabbed my shoulder roughly, wrapped his arm around my neck and shoulders, and pulled me roughly to him, and my back slammed into his solid chest-stomach area. I was about to scream, but he slammed me so hard it took my breath away. I tried being dead weight, but he was holding me so tight it didn't matter. Again, this happened over probably 10 seconds, but it felt like minutes. It was all in slow motion. I was absolutely sure I was about to get raped and or murdered. All of a sudden, like someone heard the screaming in my head, the door to the cadre shack slammed open, and someone stepped out and said,
"Hey, what are you doing out here?"
The dude dropped me and ran. He ran towards the vehicles and disappeared. I stuttered out that I had to pee, and the cadre just stood there staring at me awkwardly. I think he is unsure of what he saw and didn't know what to say. Back then, since I was a private and terrified and didn't want to be perceived as weak or making a scene, I just got up and ran back to my tent. I ended up peeing in a medical container. I'm honestly surprised I didn't pee myself. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and every single noise made me jumpy. As soon as the doctor woke up, I told her everything that happened. She was this short black woman whose personality packed a punch, and she was like, "Oh, hell no." She went straight to the cadre, and I honestly have no idea what was said or done, but we still had to be out there for another couple days, and she wouldn't let me go anywhere else alone. The artillery guys packed up and left that day, leaving us only with the gun truck guys, most of whom I knew, and I felt much safer. I never did find out who grabbed me that night or if it was even looked into, but the whole brigade received a safety briefing about traveling in pairs a couple days later.
Number 3.
For 15 months, I had a delusional schizophrenic named Ken living above me. This all started about 3 years ago and finally ended, hopefully, about a year ago. At the time, I was a single female living alone in my one-bedroom condo landlord owned. It's a low-income area, but the tenants were primarily young families and the elderly, so I felt safe enough. I had lived in my apartment for about a year and a half when Ken moved in upstairs. Immediately upon meeting Ken, I knew something was off. Ken was talkative and personable, but in that very fake sort of way. My mother had previously been married to an abusive, compulsive liar, so I'm pretty versed upon recognizing these types. First 5 months of living below Ken. Shortly after his move-in, it became known that he was a twice convicted felon and he was supposed to be evicted. No felons allowed. Somehow, he managed to talk the condominium manager into letting him stay. Ken was not immediately threatening, but more so annoying. He would do things like park in my reserved parking spot, and when I would kindly ask him to move his car to his reserved parking spot, he would politely agree. Then immediately upon moving his car, he would go upstairs and stomp around with all his might while screaming so loud that I could hear everything he was saying, which were just short bursts such as,
Why? Ridiculous!
Ken would leave me alone for weeks at a time, but then for a week or two, he would get fixated upon me. He would watch outside of his window, which faces the parking lot, and as soon as I got home from work, he would run out to talk to me about nonsense.
My wife and I are divorcing.
I never once saw a wife up there, even though he claimed she lived with him. Or he would tell me about his job, even though he almost never left the apartment. Or that his sister died that night. He must have had a lot of sisters, because he told me this lie a lot. I have a very good memory, so quickly the stories he told me didn't add up, and there were so many inconsistencies. I didn't confront him about his lies because I wanted as little to do with him as possible. Second 5 months of living below Ken. I went on a 10-day vacation with my sister, and during that time, I had a handyman remodeling and repainting parts of my condo while I was away. When I returned home, he immediately began to tell me how people were living in my apartment while I was away. He told me he heard very ominous conversations by the people living in my apartment and that I needed to be careful. Obviously, I knew all of this was a lie, but it was still creepy. I've always tried to avoid him, but at this point, I'm being extra careful. The knocking on my doors became more frequent. Somehow, he befriended a neighbor that lived one unit over. I suppose not everyone is quick to pick up on a compulsive liar. At this point, he was becoming increasingly too comfortable with me. He would ask me to come upstairs and eat dinner with him, again, cornering me on the brief seconds it took me to walk from my front door to car. If I declined, he tried to set another day to make plans. I'd politely tell him I was unavailable. He would press on.
Why? What are you doing?
I told him I was going out with my boyfriend, a lie. Shortly after this, I actually did have a male acquaintance stay the night. He must have had his ear to the floor to be able to hear that there was a male voice in my home. He knocked on my door 3 times that night and twice that morning. About a week after this, he again corners me and asks,
Do you have a problem with me?
I politely tell him no, and I'm just trying to end the conversation as soon as possible. He then begins to accuse me of a slew of things.
I know you submitted my taxes for me. Why would you do that? My mom just died. I can't believe you deleted her photos off my phone.
I'm floored and beyond uncomfortable. I firmly tell him I did none of these things and go back into my apartment. The last 5 months of living below Ken. Ken has now successfully befriended many people within the complex, which included the very elderly condominium manager. Ken's accusations against me have become even more wild. Any chance he got, he'd corner me before I could get to my door.
Please, let's just talk this through. I want to know why you hacked my internet. You've stolen $10,000 from my account. Please replace it. I know you were running a crime ring. You got me fired from my job.
I would very sternly end each conversation with a firm no. The yelling above me has also gotten worse. Sometimes he would be up until 6 a.m. screaming his head off. Sometimes it was just literal yelling, or he would yell about me or about someone else, but I was definitely a fixation. Since he had acquired many friends within the complex that believed whatever he was saying about me, people avoided me like the plague. Their children would literally run inside whenever they saw me. One instance, I was walking back from my sister's place, which was close by, and it was dark outside. I noticed the condominium manager was waiting outside of my sister's place. I walk home very briskly, and she follows me inside of her car the entire time. As soon as I arrive at my complex, Ken runs downstairs to talk to her. The accusations have now turned into legal threats.
I hope the DEA goes easy on you. This carries a minimum 10-year jail sentence. I'm pressing charges.
Since he is now threatening me legally, I finally go to the police station and tell them what's going on. They inform me, since he's not actually threatening my safety, that they cannot do anything. I have stopped answering the knocks on my doors, even though he stands to the side of my door so I can't see him through the peephole. He resorts to leaving notes on my door. I keep them and begin documenting the behavior. Life has literally become a hell inside of my apartment. Between the screaming, dirty looks by neighbors, constant cornering and door knocking, I'm getting extremely anxious. There's no way for me to break this lease since no legal action has been taken. Ken moves out. Without warning, Ken moved out. I thought this was the end of things. It was as if 1,000 pounds had been lifted off my shoulders. Shortly after Ken had moved out, my mom wanted to move into another unit within the condominium complex. The condominium manager rejects my mom's application without explanation. My mom is a tough ass, so she was going to get her explanation. My mom presses the record button on her phone and demands an explanation as to why her application was denied. The condominium manager informs her that her relation to me puts the condominium at risk. The manager is apparently under the impression that I was just released from jail and am being investigated by the FBI. My mom goes into full mama bear mode and tells the manager what she just did was illegal, that she is defaming me, etc. Then Mama Bear demands to know where she is getting these lies from. The manager says, "I don't want to get my head blown off." Mama Bear then replays the whole recording to her and said she's walking it straight to a lawyer's office if the manager doesn't answer her. Evidently, Ken and the condo manager have kept contact and have been exchanging false information about me. As soon as my mother tells me about the incident, I call the condo manager's boss. She sweetly informs me that I was arrested the night before, making the condos not want to rent to my mom. I then disclose that I work a job that requires a government security clearance, thus putting an end to all of the criminal jail nonsense, and threaten the same legal action against the condos. We come to the agreement that I will not take legal action and they will cease all contact with Ken. Mama Bear also gets to move into the condo of her choice. Ken had contacted a Facebook friend or two with the same lies, but with no one feeding the lies, he has, to my knowledge, stopped. I haven't heard anything about Ken in a year, but I still can't wait until I can afford to move out of these apartments and live somewhere Ken doesn't know about.